Good evening. My remarks will be very brief. My name's Anders Bergstrom. I'm a director here at Hauser Wirth and director of Hauser Wirth Editions. We are members of IFPDA, and I welcome you to see the Henry Taylor show after this. We'll leave the lights on so you can kind of tour through that after if you like. But literally, just that's about it. I just wanted to say welcome, everyone, and I'm going to hand it off to David Tunick.
Thank you very much. I'm the president of the IFPDA, and I'm here to welcome you to Prince from Fragonard to the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance. It's comprised of a series of short talks by 7 truly brilliant art historians focused on the art of the print. It is a joy for us to support this event, and I mean that. For those of you who don't know the IFPDA, we are the nonprofit entity that represents print dealers globally with a membership of some 150 plus galleries, including Hauser Wirth. We're grateful to Hauser Wirth, and especially their head of prints, my friend Anders, for allowing us to use this wonderful space for tonight's event. Thank you so much, Anders. A word more about the IFPDA. In addition to our annual print fair at the Armory up on Park Avenue, we host and organize panels with scholars, often in partnership with museums like the Met and MoMA. Some are in person and some are on Zoom, spanning as many as 12 time zones and drawing large audiences. Tonight's program is a collaboration between the IFPDA, or among the IFPDA, the IFPDA Foundation, and the Association of Historians of 19th-Century Art. It was, in fact, the chair of events for the Association of Historians of 19th-Century Art that proposed tonight's presentation to us, and let me say very tenaciously and successfully. And that's Michelle Foa, with whom we have very happily worked before. I look forward in a couple of minutes to hearing Michelle tell us, all of us, about Degas, an experimental printmaker who broke the rules and expanded the conventional limits of his time in spectacular fashion. A few words about Michelle. She's a professor of 19th century European art at Tulane. She's written too many articles to enumerate here. 2 books to date, one on Seurat, published by Yale University Press, and another on Degas, now under contract with Yale. She has, to her credit, numerous prizes, fellowships, and grants, including from the National Gallery of Art, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Clark Art Institute, where she organized a Degas exhibition just last year. And with that, I turn the program over to Michelle Foa.
So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I'm Michelle Foa, and this event is titled On Prince, From Fragonard to the Legacy of the Harlem Renaissance. First, I'd like to thank the IFPDA for their tremendous generosity in sponsoring this gathering and for all the work that they have done to make it happen, particularly David Tunick, Jenny Gibbs, and Michelle Stanek. And of course, I want to thank this evening's speakers, whom I'll introduce very briefly, one by one, before their presentations. In the interest of leaving as much time as possible for them to speak and for the Q&A afterwards, I will keep my introduction to the speakers very, very short, though their accomplishments and their contributions to the field are far greater than I have time to talk about. So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker. Ava Lajer-Burcharth is the William Dorr Boardman Professor of Fine Arts in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Harvard. She is the author of Necklines, The Art of Jacques-Louis David After the Terror, Chardin Material, and The Painter's Touch, Boucher, Chardin, and Fragonard, as well as the co-editor of several other volumes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and David, and everyone else involved in this wonderful venue. I'm very happy to be speaking here, but let me just arrange my mic. An oval bas-relief framed by luxuriant vegetation features a nymph jumping across the arms of two satyrs. Plate 1 of a set of 4 Bacchanals dated 1763, the etching illustrates Fragonard's foray into printmaking after his return from Rome, where he spent 5 years as a pensionnaire of the French Academy to Paris. Vaunted as arguably the most beautiful etchings of the French Rococo, the Bacchanals have remained somewhat mysterious, partly because of our uncertainty about their sources, partly because of their original conceptual dimension that has yet to be fully grasped. Drawing on antique iconography revived in the early modern period by, among others, Giovanni Benedetto Castiglione, Claude Gillot, and Charles-Joseph Natoire, Fragonard significantly inflects the subject. His scenes of cavorting nymphs and satyrs appear as sculpted fragments in the midst of leafy reeds and shrubs. Of considerable size, these are not little cameos but full-scale reliefs, these antique relics are propped up against a wall and held up in place by stones as if they were being exhibited outdoors. Their deliberate mode of display sets up a dialogue between the bas-reliefs and the surrounding nature, which, far from being a mere background, is an active component engaged with the artifacts in these depictions. The abundant foliage and twigs encroach upon the bas-reliefs. Sorry, but it doesn't really move. One tree branch seeming to have grown into the frame of the medallion. The activity of nature is echoed by the animation of the figures featured in the bas-reliefs. Barely contained by the frame, they seem as if they were about to step out of the field of representation, or else as if they have barely entered it, leaving their attributes, such as the vase with the satyr's mask, outside. The affinity with the vegetal realm is accentuated by the morphological analogies signaled by bodily details, such as the tendril-like hair. The mobile connection between figures and plants comes into sharp relief in comparison to Fragonard's friend and colleague, Hubert Robert's similar but resolutely static scene. Fragonard's handling of the medium further accentuates the interconnection between the animate and the inanimate. His command of the medium, especially the agility and fluidity of his touch, evoking the idea of etching as drawing, is remarkable. The swift movement of the artist's tools across the plate reinforces the effect of a continuous back-and-forth dialogue between art and life in these representations, raising a question. Are the bas-reliefs to be seen as an artful parenthesis within nature, or are they rather its face or emblem, as it were? A brief mention of the etching's origins may help us answer this question. While they were advertised as a discrete set of etchings by Fragonard available in Paris at Joubert's Rue de Mathurin, the Bacchanals were implicated in a larger corpus of works resulting from the collaboration between the artist and the amateur Jean-Richard Abbé de Saint-Nom. Saint-Nom, who met Fragonard in Rome and took him under his wings, engaged the young artist to execute drawings on antique subjects, which the amateur reproduced and later published in a compendium of etchings and aquatints called Recueil de Griffonniers, or the collection of scribbles. Among the drawings Fragonard produced for Saint-Nom, some of which are contained in the so-called Hofer album, At the Fog, two appear directly related to the Bacchanals, though the nature of their relation is not entirely clear for reasons that we can go to during the discussion. I need to skip ahead here. What is clear is that Saint-Non reproduced the two Hofer album designs as aquatints made after Fragonard in the Griffonie were appearing together with unrelated motifs as they do on the pages of the Hofer album. They illustrate the hodgepodge character of Saint-Non's publication, aimed to display the breadth of the amateur's artistic culture. The Bacchanals, I would suggest, were produced by Fragonard in response to Saint-Non's aesthetic enterprise epitomized by the Griffonie. While the amateur was solely interested in reproducing antique fragments, a desire with which Fragonard and his designs for him complied, the artist, by featuring nature prominently, articulated in his work a different cultural argument, thus distinguishing his own project from that of the amateur. It is precisely on the representation of nature's dialogue with the remnants of the cultural past, dear to Saint-Non's heart, that Fragonard staked his difference. The dialogical aspect of the etchings becomes clearer in the relation to a group of sanguines Fragonard produced at the Garden of Villa d'Este in Tivoli, where he spent the summer of 1760 at the invitation of Saint-Non. Marking an artistic breakthrough for the young artist, these extraordinary works offered a new aesthetic vision of the well-known site by focusing on nature. The experience of the gardens led the artist to relinquish the documentary naturalism of his earlier studies of plants in favor of rendering nature as a transformative force, a live matter overtaking, if not obliterating, the architectural relics of the past. As I have argued elsewhere, this mode of depiction implies a specific, epigenetic understanding of nature that was then being developed in the emergent natural science. In this materialist conception, of which Buffon was then a primary exponent and at which Fragonard arrived intuitively through his own experience, nature was understood as an agglomeration of ever-mobile molecules in constant process of self-generation. Though more modest in scale, the Bacchanals seems to me in an important way related to Fragonard's Tivoli drawings, both in their compositional structure, built upon a void, and their technique reenacting in etching the frenetic red chalk manner of the earlier works. The Bacchanals derive aesthetically from Tivoli's sanguines. Yet they also differ from the earlier works in one fundamental way. In them, the relics from the past are not being obliterated by nature, but remain clearly articulated. Conspicuously displayed, the bas-reliefs flaunt their representational function, suggesting a connection between the ludic scenes they depict and their surroundings. The affinity of satyrs, the figures of freedom from societal constraints associated specifically with unbridled sexuality, to nature was, of course, common enough. But what the Bacchanals emphasize is that the figure's uncontrollable libidinal impulses may be compared to the erotic behavior of nature itself. Let me skip that. The bas-relief may be seen as figural representations of nature's lustful agency. One notes, however, that it is a relatively subdued eros, skewed towards reproduction. All but one plate feature prominently the offspring of the union between the nymph and the satyr. The iconography of Satyr's hybrid family is not new per se, as Dürer's 1505 engraving makes clear, but in the Fragonard, the trope of interspecies breeding underscores the idea of nature's indiscriminate reproduction, one that, like Satyr's Eros, operates beyond the moral confines of culture. It is a materialist vision of Eros that Bacchanals promote, and we may return to some unusual gender arrangements that are part and parcel of it. Lastly, it is important to emphasize the spirit of irreverence in which Fragonard promotes his ideas. Guillaume Farroux has suggested that the Bacchanals were an amused send-off on the antichomania that replaced Rococo sensibility in the Parisian artistic culture after Fragonard's return from Rome, and thus may be related to Vien's quaintly impious Cupid cellar based on Carlo Nolli's engraving. Yet, the Bacchanals comment not only on the cultural status of antiquity, but also on nature, envisioned in them as an agent of irreverence vis-à-vis the antique, a living force of untrammeled generation, period. It is with that force, then, rather than the remnants of the past, that Fragonard aligns himself as an artist. In doing so, he separates his aesthetic project from that of his benefactor, Saint-Nom. While the latter invested in reproducing the works of others, Fragonard involved his etching tool in reproducing the world. To conclude, the Bacchanals invite us to consider two broader issues. One is the relation between the artists and amateurs, usually seen through the prism of friendship, that might be considered with more attention to its tensions and differences, especially when they throw more light on the artist's distinct aesthetic and also social position. Secondly, the prints alert us to the fact that the controversial cultural discourse, such as materialism, may sometimes be found in the least suspected place, such as Fragonard's seemingly innocent examples of Rococo virtuosity, the Bacchanals. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Ashley Dunn, an associate. Rachael, I'm sorry, I'm out of order. Oh, that's right, Rachael, I'm sorry. You're right, I'm wrong. Rachael DeLue is professor of art history at Princeton and directs the Princeton Humanities Initiative. She specializes in the history of modern art, focusing on the intersections between art and science in Europe and the United States in the long 19th century.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, super. Let me tell you what we're looking at. This is a chromolithograph made by a man named Étienne Léopold Trouvelot. And Trouvelot was French-born, but he came to the United States by 1855. He was an artist and an amateur scientist, and his first love was entomology. He was a bug guy. And he lived in Medford, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, and he conducted a massive experiment on silkworm production. That's what he did for quite a while, and he did this in his backyard. He had millions of silkworms in his backyard. He was really interested in silk production. And for those of you who don't know, silkworms are the larvae of certain kinds of moths. His entomology career came to a very abrupt and rather awful end because he decided it would be a good idea to go to Europe and find a moth he thought would make better silk, and he brought it to the United States, and it caused one of the biggest defoliations in the northeastern United States. These are called spongy moths now. Until 2022, they were known as the gypsy moth, and they're still causing millions of dollars of damage, prevention and control every year. So that didn't work out so well for him. He had a backup plan, fortunately, and that was astronomy. He had already been an obsessive observer of the heavens. One scholar has called him an observaholic. I'd never heard that term before, but I quite love it. And he'd been observing, he had his own telescope, and he'd been observing the skies for years and drawing what he saw, and this came to the notice of the Harvard Observatory, which hired him to render what was seen through their large, very powerful, large telescopes render it in drawn form, because at the time, this was the 1860s and 70s, at the time photography couldn't capture any of this. So they hired him to record the celestial objects and phenomena that were seen through the large telescope. So he worked at Harvard for a few years, and then he was hired away from Harvard by the U.S. Naval Observatory. And under the auspices of the U.S. Naval Observatory, he traveled to Wyoming Territory. It wasn't a state yet. It was Wyoming Territory in 1878 to observe a total solar eclipse. And he came away with this. This isn't the drawing he made on site. This is a chromolithograph based on drawings he made while observing the total solar eclipse. That then served as the basis for a pastel drawing of the total solar eclipse, which then served as the basis for this chromolithograph. And he made this for a portfolio that included 15 such chromolithographs. It was called the Trouvelot Astronomical Drawings book. It was published in 1881 to 1882, and it sold for $125, which was a lot of money at the time. Only about 300 copies of this portfolio were produced, and they were purchased largely by libraries and observatories who used them in teaching, research, and for display. And that's because they were considered, and they in fact were, the most accurate drawings of celestial objects and phenomena to exist as of that moment. And again, we're pre-photography here. We haven't moved into the age of astronomical photography. I'm just going to show you a few of the images that the New York Public Library has a complete portfolio. So these are a few of the images. The portfolios didn't survive, many of them, because when these images became obsolete, a lot of libraries and observatories got rid of them. So here are a couple more. They're really quite beautiful. They don't look super duper scientific to us, but they really were considered a high-end science at the time. And this is an aurora borealis, and I think I have one more example. Okay, great. They're really quite wonderful. They differ quite a lot from some of the drawings he made. These are drawings from the Harvard Observatory. And even though to our eye, these are just glorious, lovely, abstract images, these are actually quite a lot more scientifically accurate than the chromolithographs that I've just shown you. And I couldn't resist, because again, to our eyes, these chromolithographs aren't all that accurate, but they were good enough for Captain James T. Kirk of the USS Enterprise. I couldn't resist. I mean, I don't actually have an argument to make about this juxtaposition, except for the fact that they clearly didn't have an art historian on staff, because the thing is upside down. So anyway, but this is from a 1966 episode of Star Trek. So, total solar eclipses. These are really, really rare events. There have only been 3 observable in North America since 1979. One in 1979, one in 2017, and one just last year. And this was taken in Fort Worth, Texas, last year. And because they're so rare, people have been captivated by them for years and years and years, and have been painting pictures of them for years and years and years, including these. These are from the early modern period, and eclipses generally in that moment were understood as bad omens, harbingers of disaster, symbols of divine judgment. You can see there's some folks misbehaving in the lower right corner of that image, and the eclipse is meant to say, shame on you. More recently, in more recent images, eclipses, let's see, I'm going to try put there. More recent images, they're used for humorous purposes. They represent Eros, and more generally awe, the compelling nature of the thing. And as I said, in Trouvelot's time, I really have to use my art historical muscles there. Okay. Photography really wasn't up to the task of representing what a total solar eclipse looked like. And And what you're seeing here is, on the left, a painting by Howard Russell Butler of a total solar eclipse, which was painted when he was under contract with the U.S. Naval Observatory on an eclipse viewing expedition, and a photograph from around the same time. And you can see the difference, right? You can see why the observatory might have hired an artist to make a picture. And that was the case with Trouvelot. And the reason they did this is because these pictures were rather revelatory, because A, photography couldn't capture this stuff, and B, a total solar eclipse had generated conditions that allowed scientists to see aspects of the physical nature of the sun that were totally unseeable at other times. So things like the chromosphere, the solar corona, and solar prominences or flares, which are the things you can see coming out. That's on the left side, that's actually the west side. And what we have here, this is the last few seconds of totality. Eclipses, totality lasts for anywhere between 1.5 minutes and 3 minutes. And eclipses are really, really important because they allow scientists to make certain observations about the sun that can't be made at other times. And most famously in 1919, a total solar eclipse helped prove Einstein's general theory of relativity. It showed that light bends in the presence of a large, massive object. And I'm going to show you a few details to give you a sense of the sheer beauty of these chromolithographs, but also to give you a sense of the kind of detail that Trouvelot brought to representing these solar flares, or they're also called solar prominences. Here's another detail. And Trouvelot's goal was to, and I'm quoting him now, he said he wanted to represent celestial phenomena as they appear to a trained eye through our great modern telescopes. There's a whole lot to unpack there. I'm not going to take too much time to do it. Here's one more detail. There's this just beautiful softness and fluidity to the print. But if you think about what he's doing and how a lithograph like this came into being, what you're talking about is layer after layer of mediation, right? The telescope, the human eye, the drawing, and then the pastel, multiple plates that create the chromolithograph because each color has its own plate, not to mention the 90 million miles between the Earth and the sun, right? So we're talking about a pretty mediated object. And I can't help but think that Trouvelot loved the idea of mediation, of translation, of transformation, because remember, he was a bug guy. And he raised silkworms. And so he was fascinated by metamorphosis. He was fascinated by the fact that these things could make silk, that they were weavers. So there's something about these lithographs, the softness of them, the fluidity of them. They're almost biomorphic. And I've always felt that they harken back to, or even have as a kind of subtext the process of metamorphosis that Trouvelot witnessed day after day after day in caring for his silkworms. And it's really interesting, I think, when we look at a chromolithograph like this, which was made in the context of science, to think of it as something like a representation of how metamorphosis can be the product of scientific observation, right? How the end result of observation can be something so fluid and ever transforming, and never fixed in one state or condition. And I'll end there. And I his main claim to fame, this poor guy Trouvelot, was the ruination of North American forests. But I actually think he should deserve a lot more credit than he gets for these extraordinary pictures. Thanks very much.
My my apologies again to Rachael for my apparent inability to put names in their correct alphabetical order, but Ashley Dunn now is our next speaker. She is an associate curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she is responsible for 19th century French works on paper. She recently co-curated Manet Degas in 2023 and is presently working on a display about fans in the 19th century for 2026.
Thank you, Michelle, for that introduction, for organizing this event, and to the IFPDA as well for coordinating it, and to Hauser Wirth for hosting us. My object of focus this evening is this color lithograph on silk in the shape of a fan. It was made by the French artist Henri Gabriel Ibel in the early to mid 1890s. Compared to some of his contemporaries, Ibel is an understudied artist and is perhaps referenced most often as friend and collaborator of Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. And indeed they were. Here I'm showing you Lautrec's portrait of Ibel from 1892-3 on the left. And in 1893, the two artists worked together on a series of prints titled Le Café Concert, referring to the popular Parisian entertainment genre and its system of stars that became a signature subject for both artists. Ibel's cover design for the project is there on the right. That same year, the two artists also contributed prints to the new avant-garde series L'Estampe Originale. Lautrec designed the cover for the first album, here on the right, featuring the printer Père Cotel working at the press, and a stylish patron, the cabaret performer Jane Avril, inspecting a proof. Ibel's contribution, the vibrant color lithograph on the left, presents a clown seen from behind, facing the distinctive red-rimmed ring of the Cirque Fernando. This circus on the edge of Montmartre was particularly open to artists. The owner, in a rather ingenious publicity move, allowed them free access to rehearsals and occasionally performances. Like Renoir, Degas, Seurat, and Lautrec before him, Ibel took up the Cirque Fernando as a subject, drawn to the spectacular environment, larger-than-life characters, and performers who inhabited the margins of society. When Ibel's circus fan has been exhibited or published, it has generally been discussed in this context in terms of its subject. But what about its format? Why a fan? And how does consideration of its status as a fan bring meaning to the object? These are the questions I'll attempt to address in my brief time this evening. Interest on the part of avant-garde artists in fan design in this period began with the Impressionists. In 1879, Degas envisioned an entire gallery at the Fourth Impressionist exhibition devoted to fans. It would include his own designs, two of which you see here, as well as those of Pissarro, such as the one on the right, as well as fans by Bracquemont, Morisot, and Forain. Attracted to the object's associations with Spain, Japan, fashion, commerce, and the Rococo, as well as the formal challenges posed by the semicircular arc, avant-garde artists turned to fans as surfaces for experimentation in the third quarter of the 19th century. And by the 1890s, you'd be hard-pressed to find an ambitious artist who did not engage with the fan format in one way or another. Ibel was a founding member of the NABI, a group who emerged out of the Académie Julian, who were invested in making art part of everyday life. They designed furniture, screens, lampshades, ceramics, stained glass, tapestries, posters, theater sets, programs, menus, books, and more. In this context, the attraction of a fan, a ubiquitous object of bourgeois life at the time, seems inevitable. Ibel appears to have made at least 7 fan works. After making his debut at the Salon des Indépendants in 1891, the following year he exhibited a fan at that venue, the one you see reproduced here in an 1893 article on the artist in La Plume. It's also visible on the wall behind the avant-garde theater director André Antoine in the undated photograph on the right. In 1894, he reproduced it in etching, in a reduced scale, as part of a portfolio devoted to fair performers, Les Forains, also choosing it to feature on the title page. His solo exhibition at La Bodinière in 1894 included 2 fans, one titled L'Éventail du Café Concert, photographically reproduced in 1896, and possibly the one now in Geneva. Ibel's 1896 book, Demi Cabot, reproduced 3 fans, and the two we just saw, Les Forains and Le Café Concert, as well as a circus subject. although a different composition than the Met's lithograph on silk. The circus fan in the book appears as a frontispiece to a poem by the artist's brother André Ibel, titled The Circus's Impressionist Verse. The text is a kind of incoherent parody of the work of Stéphane Mallarmé, who, beginning in the 1880s, composed and inscribed poems on fans. Although it is difficult to make sense of Ibel's text, the dedication à la Maison Aristide Boucicaut conjures an essential context for thinking about the fan, that of commerce. Boucicaut was the founder of the Bon Marché department store, where one could certainly acquire fans of the very latest fashion. The medium of the circus fan in the Met collection sets it apart from the other examples considered thus far, and the majority of the fan works produced by avant-garde artists, which were typically painted using watercolor and gouache on silk or paper. The circus fan's status as a chromolithograph connects it with another major strand of fan production at this time: souvenir, publicity, or advertising fans. Here are two examples promoting the Molière circus. One directly contemporaneous with Ibel that features vignettes by multiple artists, and the other from a decade earlier designed by the French artist with a Scottish name, John Lewis Brown. Could Ibel's fan be such a promotional venture? And here I couldn't resist including this image, a kind of mise en abîme as a French poster advertising a clown holding a circus advertising fan, in which a performer holds a fan on the lower left. One naturally wonders how many impressions of Ibel's fan exist, and how widely were these intended to circulate. So far, I've found only 4 other impressions, 3 of which you see here, and notably they are all hand-colored. The Met's is the only impression I know of printed in color, although there must be others out there. The one on the lower left on this slide appeared at auction in France in 2014. It's closest to the Met's in terms of the overall palette, and I believe it's likely the white areas are printed, but the rest of the color is added by hand. At upper right is an impression in the collection of the Musée Maurice Denis, which includes yellow watercolor across the expanse of the circus ring floor. Both of these are on silk. An impression at the Bibliothèque Nationale is on the lower right and is printed on paper. It includes some annotations which appear to be instructions for the printer regarding color. Now largely missing, torn from the lower edge of the sheet, are numbered watercolor samples. Overlapping daubs of yellow and red watercolor in the lower left corner are accompanied by an inscription that translates as "yellow below to bolster the red." There remains the open question of whether Ibel intended to mount this circus fan onto sticks so that it might become functional. There is at least one example of a mounted fan in Ibel's oeuvre, this one here. Even if, as I suspect, he intended it to remain a flat design for display on the wall, it maintains, I argue, its association with the hand held, and even evokes movement with the moment of performance the artist chose for his design. The impression that appeared at auction 10 years ago was given the title Le Salut au Public, greeting the audience, and one can imagine, with the gentle flick of a wrist moving the fan forward and back, the circus performer's bows become animated. Thank you.
Though Degas produced more pictures of bathers than of any other motif over the course of his long career, the conditions surrounding the emergence of this subject in his work has surprisingly long been ignored. But I hope to show in this brief presentation that those conditions are essential for making sense of the forms that these pictures took, and more broadly, for fully understanding the importance and complexity of the relationship between Degas' motifs, materials, equipment, and methods of making. It was in the summer of 1876 that Degas produced his first pictures of women bathing indoors, some of them overlaid with pastels, such as this example. During precisely that same moment, he first began regularly making monotypes, a type of print that quickly became an important part of his practice and would remain so for much of the rest of his career. Crucially, all of Degas' early bather pictures are monotype prints, the first products of this newly adopted method of picture making. The motif of the bather and the technique of monotype printing were thus taken up by Degas at exactly the same moment, born together at just the same time. It's a connection that I'll show shaped these pictures in fundamental ways, and that serves as just one of many instances of Degas' persistent intertwining of motif and making in his career, as well as his proclivity for selecting subjects that point back to the conditions of his picture's creation. To make these monotypes, Degas took an unetched zinc or copper plate and manipulated black printer's ink on its surface to create an image. He then dampened a sheet of paper, placed it over the ink plate, and ran them through the press. The ink that was on the metal plate was transferred to the paper, resulting in a monotype print, so called because artists typically pulled only one print from each ink plate, although Degas sometimes pulled a second print and used it as the ground for some of his pastel drawings. Looking at his early bather pictures, all of which, as I said, are monotypes, one comes to realize that the materials, gestures, and tools entailed in this type of printing and in bathing converge in, I think, absolutely remarkable ways. The single tool that was most widely associated with monotypes was the rag or cloth that artists used to manipulate the medium on the metal plate. Indeed, the rag was something of the sign of the monotype artist at this time. Ludovic Lepic was a close friend of Degas and a fellow artist, and was also a devoted monotypist. During the period when Degas began making monotypes, he commemorated the technique and the artist who introduced him to it in this portrait of Lepic seated next to their close friend and fellow printmaker Marcellin Desboutin. Lepic is the figure on the right and is clearly identified with monotypes, a rag partially blackened with ink prominently resting on top of the copper plate beside him. Lepic wrote extensively about the process, and in his first published account on the subject from late 1875, he referred to the technique as muslin printmaking, after the piece of muslin cloth that he often used to wipe the ink from the plates. He concluded a subsequent essay on monotypes by exhorting other artists to take up the medium, proclaiming, "I bequeath my rag to all artists." It can hardly be coincidental that cloth and the act of wiping were essential in the making of these early bather monotypes, and are also featured very prominently in the works themselves. Thus far, I've referred to these pictures as bathers, but in nearly all of these works, Degas focused very specifically on the moment when the women are either being wrapped in a towel or robe that they'll use to wipe themselves dry, or are actually in the process of drying themselves or being dried by a maid. The wiping of ink on the metal plate with a piece of cloth is mirrored by the wiping of water from the bather's body with a towel or robe. The gestures and tools employed by Degas to produce the work directly reflected in the subject of the pictures and in the actions of the represented figures. In works like this, the alignment of making and motif is signaled by the thick black streak on the right side, created by Degas wiping ink off the metal plate, such that the act of wiping about to take place in the scene is framed on one side by the gestures used to make the work. In this example, another early pastel over monotype, streaks in the ink made by the artist are clearly visible, if you look at the detail on the right, are clearly visible in the bather's lower back, just below where the bather is drying herself with a towel. The tools and physical maneuvers of the artist and those of the depicted figure converging, each reflecting those of the other. Works like this suggest a perceived kinship on Degas' part between the artist and his depicted subjects. The acts of wiping evoking his gestures of making, and thus the movements of Degas' represented figures recalling the ones that brought these very works into being. Another important tool in Degas' monotype making process was a sponge, which we know he used to dampen the surface of the paper before running it through the press with the ink plate, as well as sometimes he also used a sponge to manipulate the ink on the plate. Not surprisingly, sponges are conspicuous in many of these early bather pictures. Here, as you can see in the tub, and in both of these works. Their peculiarly large size and highly visible placement, reflective of the way he prominently embedded the tools and maneuvers used to make the work into the depicted scenes. Similarly, the metal plates used in monotype printing were made of either zinc or copper, the very same materials out of which the tubs in these pictures were made. The shallow tubs were made from zinc, the deep tubs from copper. Finally, Degas made a point of rendering several early monotype bathers as nighttime scenes, what one perceptive critic referred to as the artist's nocturnes. Here, for example, the brightly lit interior is dramatically juxtaposed with the pitch black space seen through the open door, a clear evocation of the black field of ink that covered the plate before Degas selectively removed and manipulated it in order to form the image. These large, uniform planes of black medium both remind us of the origins of the image, their material and technical starting points, and allude to the ensuing processes of wiping, removing, drawing, and so on that ultimately resulted in a legible picture. Another bather monotype, the figure shown here, warming or drying herself by a fire as a maid combs her hair, likewise features a nighttime setting. The room so dark it's difficult to make out many of its details. Here, too, one can't help but imagine that the dark space is meant to recall the expanses of dark ink that were so distinct to the monotype making process. The specific elements visible amid the darkness of the room, evoking the artist's selective defining of legible forms out of the initially undifferentiated field of black medium that marked the picture's origins. In conclusion, these early bather pictures were thoroughly shaped by the process from which they emerged. The particular form the motif took, suggested by the materials, tools, and physical gestures used to bring these works into being. In the summer of 1876, when Degas first began making monotypes, Marcellin de Boutin characterized his adoption of the printmaking technique as a kind of fervor or obsession that had taken hold of him. And importantly, he tied the artist's investment in the process to the particular materials and equipment involved. Quote, Degas is no longer a friend, a man, an artist. He is a zinc or copper plate, blackened with printer's ink, and plate and man are flattened together by his printing press, whose mechanism has swallowed him completely. Close quote. This description of Degas being consumed bodily by the monotype process, physically pressed against the paper and run through the press, supports the notion that these materials and tools, as well as the artist's bodily gestures, were so important to his thinking about monotype making that they determined the outcome of the process in certain fundamental and long overlooked ways. Thank you. And I'll stay up here to introduce our next speaker. Rena Hoisington is curator of Old Master and 19th Century prints at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She is the author of Aquatint, From Its Origins to Goya, from 2021, and is currently organizing an exhibition tentatively entitled Tinker Tinker, printmaker in process, scheduled for 2027.
I just want to thank Michelle Foa for organizing this enlightening program. Thanks to the IFPDA Foundation. Thank you to Hauser Wirth, and thank you all very much for attending. All right. In 1896 and 1897, advertisements appeared in several American and European journals for a new engraving by the American artist Francis Scott King entitled The Ex Libris, or Bookplate of the Printer's Devil, published by the Max Williams Company in New York. With dimensions of a standard-sized sheet of paper, King's engraving was a far cry from the intimately scaled, custom-designed bookplates that for centuries had been commissioned by patrons, meant to be pasted inside the front covers of prized volumes to indicate ownership and, ideally, to ensure that said volumes would be returned to their rightful owners after they were lent or borrowed. The bookplate of the Printer's Devil may be considered King's most ambitious creation. Up to this point in time, he primarily had been known for his adept translations of paintings by other artists in wood engraving. The bookplate of the Printer's Devil was conspicuously different. A virtuoso performance in copperplate engraving, and, as one advertisement phrased it, a, quote, beautiful work of art in the shape of a bookplate, unquote. With this tour de force, King was targeting a specific market, namely bookplate enthusiasts. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed an explosion of interest in exhibiting, studying, exchanging, and collecting bookplates of the past and the present. In fact, some of the advertisements for King's engravings appeared in specialized journals dedicated to bookplates that were avidly read by aficionados, including one in the inaugural issue of the American periodical Ex Libris, which was in turn picked up and expanded upon in its German counterpart 1 year later. The bookplate of The Printer's Devil was printed in an edition of 250 impressions, offered for sale at $10 a piece, each print signed and numbered by the artist. To promote this ambitious endeavor, the savvy King also, pulled proofs that he hand-dedicated to important bookplate collectors with whom he sought to curry favor. The National Gallery of Art has the preparatory drawing and 2 proof states for the bookplate of The Printer's Devil, 2 of which bear the artist's graphite inscriptions to Edwin Babcock Holden, a New Yorker whose outstanding library contained rare first editions of European books, prints, and Americana. Holden was an active member and later president, of the Bibliophile Society, the Grolier Club, then as now on East 60th Street. From one of the posthumous auctions of his collection, we know that King gave Holden 6 progressive proofs of the bookplate of The Printer's Devil, a series that demonstrates how he engraved this design of his own invention. One advertisement described King's work as, quote, an allegory, in which the artist has indicated the mysteries of printing, unquote, and appropriately so. As is well known, accidents can, and do, mysteriously happen in a printing shop. Indeed, a venerable association linked printing presses with demons, not to mention the dark arts, with a long cultural history too extensive to discuss here, beyond noting that the term printer's devil had been used in English since the late 17th century to denote a lowly and ink-besmudged apprentice in a printing shop. King's titling of his engraving and the inclusion of the motto, though an angel should write, still 'tis devils must print. A Latin translation of a passage from Irish poet Thomas More's poem, The Fudge Family in England of 1835. This is complemented by the imaginative scene at lower left of a printmaking studio run by demons, including a muscular winged creature turning the star wheel of a rolling press. Hope you all can see that. And then at lower right, there is the preparation, that is the dampening, of paper sabotaged by an imp, sprinkling the stack with black ink from a watering can. And there's also a shower of ink rain falling from overhead. And this is to say nothing of the inky black sludge dripping down and threatening to overtake the composition at upper right, described in one journal as, quote, a very Niagara of printer's ink, unquote. But the mysterious operation of a printmaking workshop is but one of this conceptually, pictorially, and technically complex image. Encircling the massive, snarling devil's head at the center of the composition are a series of vignettes, each filled with details that cleverly reference the motifs, elements, and visual conventions of earlier book plates, the above-mentioned Latin motto being just the beginning. There are banderoles, a heraldic crest, and scrolling foliage. There are animals real and imaginary. And I hope you see there's bats, a lion's head, a dragon. Let's not forget the turtles down at the bottom. And of course, the large owl at upper left. And of course, piles, almost a river of books. More broadly, King's image nods to the history of printmaking, from scenes of the apocalypse and the danse macabre, and I hope you notice the skeleton at upper left operating the box camera on a tripod, to portrait engravings with trompe-l'oeil stone surrounds, to the sinuous ribbons of Art Nouveau design, to the work of the 19th century French printmaker Félix Bouot, who fashioned a number of book plates, to say nothing of his etching, The Demon Printer. The book plate of The Printer's Devil is the ideal work to pore over, to discover, decipher, and take delight in the details, the erudite references of which book plate and print collectors would pride themselves on recognizing. So too would devotees of the graphic arts appreciate the distinction and rarity of impressions pulled outside the edition. Indeed, the set of progressive proofs King dedicated to the influential Holden offered a highly orchestrated performance of the elaboration and vivification of the image. Showcasing his powers of invention, his knowledge of print history, and his prowess with the burin, the creation and issuing of the book plate of The Printer's Devil enabled the 45-year-old King to reinvent and publicize himself as a copperplate engraver. And it worked. By 1899, he received the first of several commissions from the Society of Iconophiles, founded by another Grolier Club member, to make engravings of remarkable places in and illustrious individuals connected with New York City for the Society's limited edition print program. To advance to the next stage of his career, King didn't need to make a deal with the devil. His strategy had paid off. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Meredith Martin, Professor of Art History at NYU. She is the co-author with Gillian Weiss of The Sun King at Sea, Maritime Art and Galley Slavery in Louis XIV's France, published by Getty in 2022, which is related to an upcoming exhibition she's co-curating for the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris.
So thank you, everyone. I find prints to be really fascinating, but also really frustrating objects to research. Fascinating for the dynamic role they can play in shaping and not just reflecting history, but frustrating in the ways that they often thwart efforts to answer some of our most basic questions as art historians about authorship, about production, circulation, and reception. And that's definitely true of this print, which I'm going to come back to in just a moment. But first, I want to take a quick detour to provide some relevant context and some concepts. So I've worked on European prints made during and just after Louis XIV's reign, so from the late 17th to the early 18th centuries. And I've studied them in relation to diplomatic exchanges that took place between France and Siam, or Thailand, and in connection with a spectacular stock market crash known as the Mississippi Bubble that shook France in 1720, prompting the creation of satirical prints that ridiculed the victims and perpetrators of this scheme. The print on the left is a French royal almanac, a type of waist-high broadsheet produced near the end of each year to celebrate the monarch's exploits, whereas the one on the right was part of a bound volume of prints lampooning this financial crash that was made in the Netherlands and circulated in France despite the best efforts of royal censors. So you have two prints of different sizes that were experienced very differently and that seem to be at opposite ends of the political spectrum. And that's true on some level, but they were also both produced fairly quickly and cheaply for middle to lower class audiences in an effort to control the narrative surrounding contemporary events. And they both profess a belief in prints, as opposed to written text, as the most effective way to do this. Prints, as one of Louis XIV's propagandists claimed in relation to these kinds of images of the Thai embassy, quote, speak equally everywhere to the eyes, purportedly transcending linguistic and cultural barriers in a way that written text didn't. And yet we know that this actually wasn't the case with French and Thai viewers of these diplomatic prints. Whereas French royal agents saw them as evidence of their dominant status, Thai officials interpreted them as a gesture of respect and deference on the part of Louis XIV. And both powers, interestingly enough, continued to hold this view in the 19th century when this exact print became part of a new set of diplomatic negotiations between these two powers that mobilized images from the past to make political claims in the present. There's a great story about this I won't get into, but it involves Thai ambassadors actually being taken into the print room of the Bibliothèque Nationale and shown these images as a kind of evidence. Prints can be quite slippery in their ability to conflate different historical moments and to suggest how history could repeat itself. And that's true of the print on the right, which actually started out as a satirical attack on Louis XIV for his aggression against Protestant rivals. Originally, in its first iteration, it was meant to depict a prostrate Sun King surrounded by overbearing mistresses, including the staunchly Catholic Madame de Maintenon. But in 1720, the plate was reworked to transform the king into John Law, the Scottish gambler who masterminded the stock market scheme. And he's shown here being read his last rites by a, quote, Mississippi nun, which is a reference to the fact that he was encouraging investment in French colonial Louisiana. Sometimes prints were repurposed without an obvious connection, but in this case, the printmakers might have been thinking about how Louis XIV's outsized global ambitions had set the wheels in motion for this contemporary crisis. So let's keep these ideas in mind when turning to look at this print. I don't actually know when, where, or by whom it was made, but it depicts a catastrophic plague that struck the French port city of Marseille in 1720, the same year as the Mississippi bubble collapse, and ended up killing nearly half the city's population. Several images were made of the event, most notably two enormous canvases by the French painter Michel Serres that were done on the spot and that were then quite unusually exhibited for pay in Paris. My print replicates the setting of the painting on the left, although a more direct source is probably another print made after this painting during the 1720s. So its author, Jacques Rigaud, claims, like Serres, to have witnessed this event firsthand, although it seems clear that he lifted many elements from Serres' painting. There are subtle differences in each of these scenes. For example, Rigaud adds a pair of avenging angels in the sky of his print to suggest divine retribution. But both he and Serres focus on the grim task of removing the dead, rotting corpses of plague victims from the city's streets, a task that had been given to the enslaved rowers of the royal galleys that since the time of Louis XIV had been based in Marseille. They also depict the city's archbishop in the foreground, highlighting his role in both preaching against the commercial greed, heresy, and licentiousness that he believed had caused the plague, and in comforting its victims. The color print that I'm focusing on seems to be a pirated version of Rigaud's print that was made a few decades after the event. It's a type of print known as a vue d'optique, which would be seen through a proto-cinematic viewing device known as a xogroscope that would give an illusionistic effect of 3 dimensions. As 18th century viewers noted, these prints could give you the effect of traveling without having to leave the confines of your home, especially useful when looking at scenes of disaster or plague. And they could also conjure a memory or a perverse thrill of a horrific past event in a visceral way, though from the comforting confines of a safe aesthetic remove. This printmaker has made some small but significant changes to the previous scenes. Instead of the archbishop in the foreground, we have galley slaves who are identified as Muslims or Turks owing to the distinctive topknots that they wear. Such figures were an important component of the galley rowing force, enabling Louis XIV to claim that he was fighting and enslaving Muslim infidels in the Mediterranean, while at the same time continuing to broker favorable trade agreements with the Ottoman Empire and its North African affiliates. Gillian Weiss and I have argued elsewhere that these enslaved Turks appear prominently in plague scenes, and they're emphasized in Michelle Foa's paintings too, because they stoked anxieties about the source of the contagion, which was believed to have come from Muslim lands, and also because they engaged debates about the risks of France engaging in global commerce at this precarious moment, which is an anxiety that the Mississippi bubble prints raised too, in a very different way. And that fear, I think, could have been amplified by this 3D zogroscope effect of a kind of onrush of foreign immigration, global commerce, and this chaos that would supposedly ensue. So although these plague prints claim to be forms of documentary reportage, suggesting a kind of reality effect that this vue d'optique may have amplified, in fact, they make false claims about the event and its implications. Enslaved Turks, as the painter Michelle Foa well knew, were considered far too valuable to the galley rowing force to be used for removing contagious corpses, which was essentially a death sentence. Turks were valued both literally and symbolically, not only in their own time period, but also a century later, when images of the Marseille plague, like this one, began to recirculate in France as part of a massive propaganda effort to, quote, finish what the Sun King had started and to invade and colonize Algiers. These images also have disturbing echoes and reverberations during our own time period, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, which began exactly 300 years after the outbreak of plague in Marseille. During lockdown, Gillian and I wrote a piece about how these 18th century depictions of plague seem to spotlight an ugly human tendency to blame contagion on the same, quote, foreigners, who are then often tasked with cleaning it up. And we also noted parallels in the rhetoric around the Marseille plague, which was called the Levantine plague, and the so-called China virus, especially as it pertained to global commerce and to foreign immigrants. So, plus ça change. To quickly conclude, I'm currently co-organizing with Gillian an exhibition on enslaved Muslims in Marseille and other Mediterranean ports for the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris that will open in 2016. We will have this example and many other prints in the exhibition, several of which attempt to highlight the humanity of the enslaved subjects they depict, which I think this print does too to some extent, despite the fear-mongering that it's connected to. And it'll be interesting to see how the show is perceived in France, but I can guarantee that it will be repurposed once again for a different political moment, and it'll give these artworks a new life. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, Brittany Salisbury is curator of printed drawings at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where she is responsible for modern and contemporary works on paper. Her exhibitions and publications include Altered States etchings in late 19th century Paris, Degas and the Laundress, Women, Work, and Impressionism, and with Eric Benet, Karamu Artists, Inc., Printmaking, Race, and Community, which opens in March of 2025.
And thank you. It's my turn to thank Michelle for inviting me to participate in this event, and the IFPDA, and Hauser Wirth for hosting. So, Charles Sallé's Swing Time presents a scene that is superficially uneventful, but rich with meaning. From this depiction of a Cleveland nightclub and its patrons, we can learn about the impact of the Harlem Renaissance on cities that have traditionally been considered peripheral to the movement, about the pioneering efforts of Karamu Artists, Inc., a group in which Sallé was centrally involved, toward Black collective creativity, and we can better understand the way in which Black artists negotiated the opportunities and limitations inherent to the Work Progress Administration's Federal Arts Project. The best way into these complex issues is through the print itself. We are fortunate to have the artist's own description of what the image depicts. In the context of a 1941 exhibition, Sally wrote, quote, "I was sitting in Cedar Gardens when the jukebox was playing. Suddenly, this girl got up and began to do a dance which had a strange and different rhythm. Her movement was wonderful to see. I did a sketch attempting to catch her rhythm and her remoteness from the people who watched her. A few minutes later at home, I did this drawing." The work that resulted from this experience comprises a network of unmet gazes, each of which is directed away from the viewer. Despite the inherently communal experience of sitting in a club, each figure appears disengaged from the others around them, absorbed in their own experiences and thoughts in a way that is amplified by the hazy atmosphere Sally evoked through layers of grainy aquatint. Aquatint also played a major role in the racial ambiguity of the five figures in the print and was key to the actual location that it depicted. We can recall that Sally named the club as Cedar Gardens, a nationally renowned black and tan club that opened on Cleveland's Cedar Avenue in 1934, a few years before Sally depicted it. Such venues were intersectional in a way that was unusual for the time, attracting both black and white patrons, but also members of the LGBTQ community. Cedar Gardens, in particular, was known as, quote, "the most famous night spot between New York and Chicago" during the 1930s, and featured entertainment including jazz, but also drag shows. It was listed prominently in the Green Book, a popular guide to Black-friendly establishments during the Jim Crow era. Venues like Cedar Gardens were common in the neighborhood surrounding Caramoo House, a cultural center premised around racial equity and integration that was established in Cleveland in 1915. The arts were key to the institution's founding and were considered a means of elevating the social status and lived experiences of Black artists and community members. Caramoo connected a constellation of artists and writers from Charles Salé to Langston Hughes, who got his start and even made prints there. It remains an important cultural center today, especially now for its internationally recognized performing arts and theater program. Charles Salé was among a group of artists who came together during the late 1930s at Caramoo and eventually formed an influential collective known as Caramoo Artists, Inc. A native of Northeast Ohio, Salé was the first Black student to be admitted to or to graduate from the Cleveland School of Art. In 1935, he received a scholarship through Caramoo House that supported his education in exchange for his assistance teaching in the studio art program there. And this photograph from around the time of Sally's involvement highlights some of the aspects that were distinctive about Caramoo's program and that differentiated it from similar institutions like the Harlem Community Arts Center or Chicago's Southside Community Arts Center. Caramoo's program was specifically non-hierarchical, so artists and community members learned alongside a teaching artist rather than through formal instruction. It was also different in that it was not formally part of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project and received primarily community support alongside only occasional government funding. Salé learned within this program and went on to teach portraiture within it, and he quickly became known for intaglio portraits like Anna and Bertha that represented members of the Caramoo community, including fellow students and models. He also benefited from the experimental atmosphere of the federally funded WPA Graphic Arts Workshop established in Cleveland during the Depression, which was one of only 5 in the nation. Salé was the artist who most actively adopted offset soft ground etching, a technique that the staff claimed was invented there, that involved transferring a drawing to a copper plate to create middle tone that was more granular than aquatint. Around the time that he created Swing Time, Salé had begun to work closely with a group of printmakers who, in 1940, came together under the name Caramoo Artists, Inc., an allusion to their roots at and connection to Caramoo House. Their initial membership included Elmer W. Brown, Fred Carlo, Zell Ingram, Huey Lee Smith, William E. Smith, and Thomas Usher. That year, the group drafted a mission statement and bylaws asserting that, quote, quietly and almost unnoticeably, they had together made, quote, achievements perhaps unparalleled anywhere else in the United States as Black artists. They also described themselves collectively as, quote, the largest group of producing Black artists of standing in the country, according to Dr. Alan Locke of Howard University, evoking the philosophical architect of the Harlem Renaissance to argue for their national relevance. The members of Caramoo Artists, Inc. experimented with a wide range of techniques and each developed highly individual styles, but all used linocut. a process that could be completed with little prior training and inexpensive materials in or outside a studio. Its accessibility was essential to the art that members of Karamu Artists, Inc. made there during a brief but prolific period during the 30s, 40s. While many artists at this time focused on negotiating European modernism, Karamu Artists, Inc. balanced those concerns with a sustained focus on, in the words of one member, quote, integrating art into the community life. They actively worked to articulate a vision for what printmaking should do and could be. Member Zell Ingram summarized some of these concerns in a 1940 letter to Langston Hughes, where he cites wanting to, quote, continue my work in my community, to use as my inspiration the life of the people in my community, and to overcome the, quote, detachment of the artist from the people around him. Another member, Huey Lee Smith, wrote similarly that, quote, if art is to be meaningful, it must grow out of the social climate of its time. For the members of Karamu Artists, Inc., this project culminated in a 1942 exhibition, originally planned for MoMA, but actually held at Associated American Artists Gallery in New York, where their work was seen on a national stage and praised by critics from publications including the New York Times and Opportunity. In the years that followed, several members, including Charles Salé, served in the First World War, and this led to the informal dissolution of the collective. The legacy of the group and their collective activity lived on in some of the first major histories of Black art, however. And returning to Swing Time, Salé's print played an important part in this legacy. In his influential 1943 survey of contemporary Black artists, historian James A. Porter singled out both this etching and Salé himself, calling him a leader of Karamu Artists, Inc. for his attempt to situate Black subjects, quote, in characteristic relation to the typical urban life of a northern city. In prints like Swing Time, Porter wrote, Salé, quote, uses the etching needle to reach the masses of people directly and effectively. So just a little bit of self-promotion. The Cleveland Museum of Art's forthcoming exhibition, Karamu Artists, Inc. Printmaking, Race, and Community, will be the first to focus specifically on Salé and on the other members of this group, who come up often in histories of the Harlem Renaissance and of the WPA, but haven't actually been looked at closely. And so I hope that you will be able to see the exhibition or will consider pre-ordering the publication from Yale University Press, which includes essays by scholars in the field, as well as our humble attempt at a comprehensive catalog raisonné of their work. Hopefully this will encourage future scholars to take a closer look at it as well. And so we look forward to hopefully sharing these prints with you this spring.
So I think we have time for some questions, and I'm sure the speakers welcome them. So just raise your hand, I think, if you have a question, and Michelle will bring you the mic.
If we could hear a little bit more about chromolithography, how it came to be, and what your definition of chromolithography is.
Sure. Yeah. So let me see if I can do this in 1 minute or less. But lithography was a medium that was invented in, somebody can help me with this, but late 18th, early 19th century, right? And it was prized by artists because it allowed direct drawing on a stone, and that made for much more fluid marks and much more affinity to freehand drawing. Chromolithography is pretty similar, except the word chromo suggests that it's colored, and what happens with the chromolithograph is there are separate stones. So a lithograph is a stone. One draws on the stone. For chromolithography, there are separate stones. Each color is on a stone, and then they're successively printed onto the receiving surface. And this can take, it depends on what the range of the palette is, but this can take weeks, even months, to put a single print together. It's a pretty extraordinary process, but it allows for incredible nuance of color and really, really fine detail, as you saw in those solar prominences of the chromolithograph. I don't know the exact dates of the chromolithographies coming into being, but I have a feeling that it was very shortly after the invention of lithography itself. How was that? Okay.
Can I just do a follow-up question? Did he actually do the printing and the making of the lithograph, or was he only the designer?
That's a great question. So he was the designer, and he hired lithography or printing firms to do the printing for him. But he oversaw it very closely. He was kind of obsessive about everything he did, and so he pretty much looked over the shoulder of the lithographers. And that's why he prepared the pastel. He didn't just give them as drawings. He prepared a pastel picture for them to work from.
Oh, good. Hello. I have a question about scale, specifically for Rena and for Rachael. So first, I'd love to hear how big the bookplate print was and just how detailed it actually was. Was he riffing on that scale and actually made it bigger, or was he really trying to kind of ape the size of normal book plates? And for Rachael, and anyone else who wants to chime in about the scale of their objects too, I'm thinking, chromolithography can be quite large. Was he playing with scale in terms of trying to capture these momentous astrological events? Or anyway, interested to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks for that question. So yes, it is an outsized book plate. It's about 8.5 by 11 inches, like the size of a standard sheet of paper. And that was commented upon in several of the advertisements. The interesting thing is with the German advertisement in the Ex Libris Journal, they mentioned that the New York publishers also sent them a small, i.e. usual book plate size, photo mechanical reproduction, but commented that it, which was uneditioned, and commented that the detail and the contrast of light and dark obviously paled in comparison to the engraving of the larger scaled work. Yeah.
So the Trouvelot chromolithographs were quite large. They were 38 by 40 inches. So that's partly why they were such a high ticket item. Like I said, they were $125 in the 1880s. I don't know what that is in today's terms, but it's a lot. And so they were pretty high end, top shelf lithographs. And I think that he wanted. He only made 300, and they were portfolios, and he wanted them to be a high quality item. But I also think that scale was absolutely a reflection of the awe he felt in the face of the celestial, but also a desire to try. What he was doing is trying to put the heavens in a rectangle in 2 dimensions, right? And so the bigger you get, the more close, given your limited media, that you can get to that. So I think that the scale reflects that as well.
Thank you.
On Degas, I was very interested in what you said, given that he was turning more to pastels in about 1880 when he was losing his sight. And when you were talking about the rags and so forth, I was wondering whether he wasn't not only feeling his way through with pastels, but what you said about rags, feeling his way through what he was doing in his composition and the different decors. So that was of interest to me.
That's a very interesting question. That's a very interesting question. I tend not to deal with the issue of his sight because he complained about his site from the very beginning of his career, from the early 1870s, which is, before. I don't think he was losing his sight by 1880, because we have very, very precise works by him that an artist who was having serious vision problems would not have been able to produce. Like which work specifically? I think a lot of them are quite precise. I mean, I think in some ways the monotypes, as messy as they can seem, there's a certain elements of them are extremely precise and extremely precisely rendered and marked. So I do think the 1890s are a time where you can see in his work, especially the later half of the 1890s, where if you want to bring in his vision problems into his production, I think that would be the period to do it, because the works do change quite visibly in style from what he had been producing before. So thank you so much for that question. Would anyone else like the mic? I think we only have a few more minutes, so then maybe we'll leave it there.